Hello everyone, my name is Henderson, and this channel primarily deals with wildlife photography, but we do a lot of that from the sailboat and from the dinghy. This particular video will cover my sailboat trip from Charleston, South Carolina to Gulfport, Florida. Gulfport is part of the St. Petersburg area. This will be a relatively long video because it's going to cover the entire trip in one video. I hope you'll stick around and enjoy the majority of it. The trip was made on a Compac 23, which is a relatively small boat, but even though it's a small boat, it does represent my home, as I'm currently living aboard my sailboat, and I'm currently moored in the anchorage at Gulfport, Florida. So if you're interested in videos about wildlife photography from a boat, then this might be a good channel to subscribe to. If not, then just enjoy the video, and there are some other sailing type of videos on the channel, but not a lot. So thank you so much for joining us, and let's get started. The trip started in Charleston, South Carolina, in a marina known as Cooper River. And most of this video will be done as a voiceover because I doubt that you want to hear the droning of an outboard engine the majority of the time during the video. One outstanding thing about this trip was the number of bridges that we either went under or went through, such as a swing bridge or a bascule bridge or something. So you'll see a number of bridges in this video. Plus we have a number of locks that we went through on the Okeechobee waterway. Now, not everyone travels in a small sailboat. Some people travel in a little bit more opulence, such as this guy. One of the most common type of bridges that we go under are known as bascule bridges, and these consist of two opening leaves on either side, and you usually call the bridge tender on channel 9 on a VHF radio and request an opening. Some bridges are on a specific schedule, especially Monday through Friday during the work week, and other bridges are on less congested roads and they open on request. My first day on the water was pretty uneventful. Pretty much left the marina and navigated through the Charleston area and then gradually began to head south. On average, I was covering about 40 miles a day, and I was at the tiller for roughly 11 hours a day. I do not have a autopilot of any kind, so all of my work was pretty much occupied with sitting in one place, holding the tiller and trying to pay attention. I have a few compromises like anyone that is getting older, and one of my compromises is my eyesight is rapidly decreasing, and that became somewhat of a major issue on this trip because it was very hard for me to see the day markers, the cans and the buoys, and things like that, especially on big open channels. And the compass that I have is kind of clouded over, so I wasn't able to use that as a navigation instrument. So consequently, my first day I ended up aground towards the evening. And by aground, I mean the boat was solidly affixed to the mud. And I had to wait until the tide rose at 3 in the morning to be able to get off and get back into the open waterway. One of the beautiful things about being aground is you have time to do things you wouldn't normally have time to do, like cooking. And of course, for a trip like this, you need to provision because the trip length is approximately 30 days long. So I went and got a bunch of canned goods and a few refrigerated goods. I do have one of those little 12-volt type of refrigerators, and I was able to cook myself some fairly decent meals. Usually when I wasn't aground, these meals were either early morning or late in the evening. I did not stop while underway to cook a meal. I would usually just get a protein bar during the middle of the day to hold me over. My navigation challenges in being aground were not limited to this first evening, because of course my eyesight didn't get any better after running aground. So I learned after the second grounding that I definitely needed some help. I needed some type of instrument to help me be able to see where the next markers were. And I went and purchased a Garmin GPS Map 79 SL at West Marine. Of course, I had to stop at a marina and run into town and get the device, but that became a real game changer. And I'm so thankful that I got that, because without that, this trip would not have been possible. And of course, not only were we dealing with eyesight issues, we were dealing with weather issues. It seems that we had a rain squall almost every afternoon, especially once we got into Florida. It was just about guaranteed at 4:30 that you were going to get waxed by some major thunderstorm. On occasion, you got thunderstorms while you were at anchor. And I had one occasion where I drug anchor because of some 30 to 40 mile per hour winds that caused me to ride all over the anchorage. And that entailed having to go and pick up another anchor to help with this trip. So the expenses didn't stop just because I left the dock. It's a little bit hard to see, but way up in the distance there is a submarine going out with a military escort over on the left-hand side. I was traveling down the channel here, and coasties came up and told me to park it until all of this got clear. So kind of cool. Not every day you get to watch a submarine leave the submarine base. This is St. Mary's, Georgia, and this is the location of the submarine base for the U.S. Navy. I actually helped build the dock that is here at the submarine base way back in the early 80s when I was a geologist working for a company known as Law Engineering. Event that I witnessed was on the July 4th weekend was a fire aboard a small pleasure boat, and you can see here the boat on fire and the response by the St. Augustine Fire Department. This was just south of Jacksonville, so it was in the region for St. Augustine Fire Department, and you can see them putting the fire out here. Certainly a bad day for someone. Of course, one of the outstanding things about the July 4th weekend, or really any weekend, were pleasure boaters, and especially power boaters. They seem to be in tremendous abundance, and anytime you're on a small boat and a big boat goes by, or a power boat with a big set of engines, it tends to really rock and roll your boat. You have to head into the waves to keep from getting everything thrown about. On the East Coast, most of your bridges are tall bridges. They're fixed bridges that you don't have to call to get an opening. However, once you reach Lake Okeechobee waterway or the west coast of Florida, everything changes. You get into an area with a lot of bascule bridges, swing bridges, locks, and other things that slow down your navigation. When traveling from Charleston to Florida, there's a lot of big open bays like St. Andrews Sound, Charleston Harbor, and so on. Once you get down into Florida, the waterway gets a little bit more narrow in some parts, and you get a lot of the affluent houses and beautiful scenery. One of the big advantages of being on a small boat is the ability to use the Lake Okeechobee waterway. This is a waterway that cuts across Florida and means that you don't have to go all the way south to Miami, cut it down below the Florida Keys, and come back up the west coast of Florida to the Fort Myers area. You're able to cut across Florida at St. Lucie or Stewart and go through the waterway and across Lake Okeechobee and then across the Caloosahatchee River and out into Fort Myers, thereby cutting off a lot of the headache that is South Florida. The current clearance under this bridge is 54 feet, and of course that's tidal dependent and also dependent on the amount of water they release out of the locks from the lake and whatnot. So if you've got a tall mast and you're not willing to drop your mast, this is not a direction you'll go. So I'm in the St. Lucie lock and it's filling with water, and my job is to tension the bow and the stern lines alternately to keep the boat at a proper distance off the wall. Not the easiest job in the world when you're single-handed. You can see the gates are partially open. Now it's allowing in some of the water that it's at a higher level in order to equalize the water inside the lock with the water outside the lock, effectively raising us up to the water level outside the lock. So we're almost equalized here. Very little water is coming in through the crack in the lock doors. Soon the lockmaster will be opening the lock doors and we'll be exiting. On the East Coast side and the West Coast side, next to the two somewhat major cities, the houses are somewhat large and affluent. But as you get towards the middle of the waterway, more closer to Lake Okeechobee, the houses are less affluent. There are a total of 6 locks going across Lake Okeechobee, 3 on the eastern side and 3 on the western side. However, the lock at Clewiston just goes into the city itself, and it's usually open. You don't have to actually lock through it. So in actuality, there's only 2 locks on the east. That would be the St. Lucie lock and the Port Mayaca lock, and then 3 locks on the western side. And that would include the Moorhaven lock, the LaBelle lock, and the Franklin lock. This is what the lake looks like today. Pretty much pea soup. Well, no trip would be complete without some real excitement, and by excitement I mean breakdowns. I had an occasion where I thought I had a lower unit problem because the prop was not turning, but it turned out to be a relatively simple fix. The shear pin had broken that connects the prop shaft to the prop. because of the kindness of another person who brought me a dinghy, I was able to get access to the boat and to go ahead and get it repaired. Once I reached the end of the Caloosahatchee River, which is the end of the Okeechobee waterway, I finally was able to turn north, and this was after about 600 miles of traveling from Charleston. So I had traveled roughly, 450 miles from Charleston to Stewart, and then roughly 150 miles from Stewart to Fort Myers. And now finally I'm turning north and heading up towards the St. Petersburg area. Well, I won't bore you with what turned out to be bridge after bridge after bridge and a lot of waiting in order to be able to go past these bridges. But as you go from Fort Myers to the St. Pete area, you do go through a lot of the waterway that crosses a lot of minor roads. And so there's a lot of bascule bridges and swing bridges. I will introduce you to some of the food that I ate along the way. Of course, I ate every day on the boat, but on occasion, when I would stop in order to get fuel or something, usually about once every 5 days, I would take a single meal and eat usually somewhere near the marina. And since I've been living in the state of Michigan for so long, I had a real hankering for good fresh seafood, and I had a lot of fresh shrimp along the way. So I hope you enjoy these plates that I'm showing you. Well, my original plan when I started this trip was to do the entire 1,700 miles from Charleston to North Mississippi. This would entail part of the trip we've already done, which is going down the East Coast from Charleston to St. Lucie Stewart area, then crossing the state of Florida at the Okeechobee waterway, and then going up the west coast of Florida to roughly Clearwater, and then making the jump from Clearwater to Mobile, and then running the rivers from Mobile, the Tom Bigby waterway, up to what is known as Fulton, Mississippi. Total distance would have been roughly 1,500 miles. But after getting to Clearwater, decided I really liked the anchorage in Gulfport. My daughters live in Gulfport. I used to live in St. Petersburg, which is part of the area that Gulfport is part of. And I just decided it's time to take a rest. So I turned the boat around once I got to Clearwater and returned to Gulfport, and that's where I'm at now. I called up my daughter. Actually, I called up both daughters. One of them was able to come meet me for dinner. The other one was busy that night. This is Sheila and I enjoying a meal at a local restaurant down by the anchorage. Hey everybody, Sheila and I, this is my daughter. She's my oldest daughter, and we're here enjoying dinner together and a drink. So say hi, Sheila. All right, everybody. Thank you. She's a wonderful daughter. Sheila and Pamela are my two biological children. I have three stepchildren, Lina Rose, Katie, and Matilda. Well, folks, that's it. That's a trip from Charleston, South Carolina to St. Petersburg, Florida. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you would, go ahead and take a look around the channel and see if there's anything else you'd like to take a look at. If you like the content that we do here, you might want to consider subscribing. Most of our content is wildlife photography and nature related, but I do videos about tiny houses and sailing and all kinds of other subjects. So I hope you'll join us on the channel, and I thank you so much for sitting through this particular video. Thank you so much, and God bless. I'll see you again very soon. Goodbye.